not just a reaction to colonialism, that we actually had indigenous African attempts to unite ourselves on the continent of Africa prior to enslavement and colonization. And part of the challenge that we have as African people is that we have to return to the path of our own history making. Amilcar Cabral taught us that, if you like, colonialism took us away from the path of our own history making and the development of state, not only state building, but also nation building, which was severely interrupted. And that has, as has already been said, has made us very fragmented and weak and unable to deal with the global challenges that we face. So there have always been Pan-African organizing leaders who have interfaced with what we now call the global justice movement, which we know is not a singular movement. It has all these various contingents. And there is a kind of Eurocentrism that often comes out in the global justice movement, where we assume it's something that is led here in the West or European-led, but that's not the case. And so we have to locate ourselves back into this movement, because the very beginnings of neoliberal globalization in particular started with the separation of the globes and the colonization and of not only African people but indigenous peoples. And our resistance to that, which has been ongoing, has to form part of what we now recognize as the global justice movement and the various contingents. So you will find there are Pan-African dimensions within anti-capitalist, the environmental, the trade justice, anti-poverty, anti-debt movements, and the various configurations. And of course, Pan-Africanism as a movement is a contingent of that global justice movement. And then within that, the movement that I'm part of and represent is the reparations movement, the international social movement for African reparations, and in particular, very much it's contingent here in the UK. So we have this unbroken trajectory of struggle, of resistance, of reclamation of our humanity, reassertion of our dignity, and our attempt not only to solve the issues that we face on the continent and throughout the diaspora, because let us remember the diaspora is global. African people are a global people. And we are spread throughout the four corners of the earth. So that is we cannot organize even in a Pan-African way without taking into account positive globalization and where we're located. So some of the key issues then that come up is how best do we do that? What we've spoken about is the need for an organizational mechanism to be able to deal with and address us at this current phase of our struggle. And that's one of the things that has been severely affected as part of our organising, especially here in the UK. But we are in the process. In particular, there are some of us here in the UK who very much come out of this historical trajectory of Pan-Africanism. And it's not a new movement, and we carry that on. And we are in the process of evolving and developing the organizational formations that can actually embrace this broad diversity of big picture thinking and analysis that we have to engage in as African people.
I'm going to get straight into it because of time. What I'm going to do is give a broad overview of some of the different realities that are being lived out in Latin America, in the hope that we can make connections between some of the themes which affect the African diaspora and find ways in which we can strengthen the promise of Pan-Africanism. I believe we Latin Americans and Africans share a colonial past, so I hope some of the things I mentioned here serve as ways of interchanging and tackling together our colonial past in order to find ways to move beyond it. So in Arturo Escobar's book, and I don't know if you may have come across it, Encountering Development, the Making and Unmaking of the Third World, Escobar demonstrates that the concept of development, as it is understood by many today, is nothing more than a specific Western knowledge system embedded in a modernizing discourse that was designed to ultimately create, manage, and dominate the so-called third world. The discourse sells us the idea of material progress through industrialization as the only and inevitable path to modernization. In the process, underdeveloped countries become the target of programs and interventions that essentially ensure their control. This proposed modernity cannot be understood without taking into account the colonial difference that has been ever present in the reality of the so-called developing world. Colonialism, or neo-colonialism, if you want to call it that, ensures the control not only of resources and labor, but also of the very cultures and knowledge of the colonized groups. It has been in this context that Afro-Latin Americans, indigenous groups, and peasant groups have for long been at the receiving end of countless repressive, discriminatory, racist, and violent actions by distinct groups, usually with an agenda that fits kind of cynically into the development modernity paradigm. Now, as most of you probably know, Colombia is currently undergoing peace negotiations to bring an end to a conflict that has spanned for more than 50 years. And whereas the complexity of the conflict is probably beyond what I want to say today, I do want to highlight an issue that gets overlooked as we reach sort of maybe the what seems to be the end or promises of peace. And that is the fact that in Colombia, the displacement of people and communities doesn't happen because there is a conflict. Rather, the conflict happens so communities can be displaced. And I'll explain what I mean. Just last November, women from the predominantly Afro-descendant community of La Toma in southwest Colombia decided to march to the capital Bogota in order to protest against the presence of mechanical diggers carrying out illegal, violent, and environmentally destructive gold mining in their territory. La Toma is an Afro-Colombian community of around 5,000 people, which was founded in the early 1600s by Afro-descendants who had escaped enslavement and fled to a large mountainous area between the municipalities of what is now known as Suarez and Buenos Aires. In the early 2000s, paramilitaries arrived to the region surrounding La Toma and began carrying out horrific crimes, including massacres and mass-scale forced displacements. They did so as they sought territory and land for exploitation. Around the same time, and certainly not by coincidence, the government accelerated the number of mining concessions it handed to national and international investors. This happened without any prior consultation and without the consent of the local Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. In this chaotic situation, multinational companies like AngloGold Ashanti took advantage of the brutal violence being advanced by the conflict, which smashed community resistance, and by doing so were able to acquire land and expand their mining operations. By 2009, around 35 mining concessions had been approved. Now, it's important to highlight that from the perspective of Afro-descendant movement organizations and organizations of displaced peoples, all of the external actors in Colombia, including guerrillas, paramilitaries, capitalists, and the state, share a similar project, namely the appropriation of territories for the radical reconfiguration of the region along the lines of a capitalist modernity project of extraction and exploitation of natural resources.